So now we move on to the final faction that is all new to patch 0.97 for the faction overview series, and I am of course talking about the Hobbit folk of the Shire. The place where most of the adventures of Middle-earth seem to begin and end. However, it is interesting to note with regards to the Shire, they don't really fit in to a lot of the categories that govern most of the other factions. For example, they are not Western men, they are not Eastern men, they are not dwarves, they are not elves, and they are not orcs. So they are somewhat unique in that regard, and they do have a very unique playstyle as well as a very unique lineup of units, which has some rather distinct strengths and weaknesses to say the least. But while they may be diminutive in nature, the halflings are nothing if not plucky and very good when they're the underdogs. So they are actually a faction which has gained a bit of a devout following among the Third Age Reforged community already. So with that in mind, I think it's about time that we moved right along with some of the strengths and weaknesses of the Shire. And the first thing that's going to be very important when you're playing as the Shire is that you do have access to certain special units which are extremely powerful. So for example, the likes of Ents and Bjornings, which are almost like the big brothers to the Hobbits as they get picked on by the bigger kids in the playground. They are very, very important to keeping your army together. They're also very important for doing a lot of damage quickly, because a lot of the rest of the roster, as I'm sure you'll know, is not going to be the most resilient, nor is it going to be the most damaging, but again, we'll get onto that when we move on to the weaknesses of the faction. But suffice it to say that they do have access to these units which can make up for that. You're going to need to use units like your Ents and your Bjornings, which of course we will also get onto when we move to talking about the roster, effectively if you're going to have any sort of long-term success, because while the Shire is pretty good at putting off a direct frontal engagement against a lot of the other more heavy-duty factions, there will come a time when you will need to engage the enemy. One of the best ways in which you can do that is to use your special units to really lay down a lot of damage quickly and also support your hobbits, which may very well need it. Of course, you can also rely on your teammates to do this, but you won't be able to rely on your teammates 100% of the time. You may not even be doing a battle in which you may be doing a battle in which you're the only player, so you will need to rely on these kinds of units even more. But they are very, very powerful. As an individual unit, I'm sure that everyone knows how strong the Ents are, and the Bjornings also, as far as a cavalry unit goes. When you've got a bunch of wild men riding bears, it sort of confers a certain sense of power that you have. But it is important to use them, and they come with their own weaknesses, of course. They tend to be the most expensive units in the Shire faction, and also they do tend to have a relatively low unit count, so if you do start to bleed models too early, it can be a bit of a disaster for you. But they are also very resilient, as well as being very powerful on the attack. So generally speaking, as long as you're not overly careless, you will be able to get them to survive, you will be able to deliver them to the enemy lines, and you will be able to support your own men as well as kill off a lot of enemies with them. The second thing to note about the Shire as well, that they have a lot of ranged options in their roster, really a lot. In fact, I would say the vast majority of their roster at least has the option of a ranged attack, even if it has a limited amount of ammunition. A lot of dedicated ranged units, a lot of hybrid ranged units as well, and this is also going to be very important to the Shire, because you can't really afford to just go into a direct engagement like you can. The Hobbits do have a few tricks up their sleeves in melee as well, but for the most part the real strength of their faction lies in the fact that they do have a ton of ranged units which they can use to really bamboozle the enemy. You can do a lot of damage with them quickly as well. You also have access to many different kinds of ranged units, it's worth saying as well. You have archers, you have rangers, you have javelins, all of the main cornerstones of a really effective skirmish force. A lot of them tend to be able to hide as well. Being able to ambush is a big part of playing as the Shire, and in particular this will matter with their ranged units, because if you can really set up your ranged units into a killing field, while the enemy may want to engage you in melee as quickly as they possibly can, they may charge forward too recklessly and they may end up getting killed off quickly as a result. Also the famed Hobbit slingers are also back here as well, so they'll be able to throw their pebbles into melee, or into enemy units as they charge forward also. A lot of units that the Shire has at their disposal to really lay down a hurting at range, but of course that also comes with perhaps some certain downsides. If you lean too heavily into your range, for example, you can leave yourself with not enough melee units when the time comes that you need to engage. But still, having more options is never a bad thing. And the final strength I will mention here does pertain to their melee units, while we will get on to a distinct weakness of their infantry pretty soon. The fact of the matter is that they do have some very diverse counter units. They have a lot of units. Most, if not all of their infantry is either good against cavalry, good against armour, or both, which means that they do have the ability to trade somewhat efficiently with quite a lot of units in the game. Now, of course, this won't apply to everyone. For example, if you're going up against, say, the Elves of Lindon, all of your armour-piercing units suddenly become pretty woefully inefficient. But a lot of factions do have at least a handful of heavily armoured units for which your armour piercing will be very, very useful against, and the Hobbits have a surprising amount of armour piercing at their disposal. Also, a lot of units which are good against cavalry. Again, if you take some really nasty charges, your bonus versus cavalry won't count for an awful lot when you're being trampled underfoot by a bunch of quality lancers. But nonetheless, enemy cavalry forces will have to be very careful of you, and that's really how you're going to have to use the Shire's infantry force. You're going to need to set up your engagements to be as beneficial as possible to work with your counters, because if you don't, the stats alone will certainly not be enough to carry you through. Speaking of which, I think it's about time we moved on to some of the weaknesses of the Shire. As perhaps should not be surprising, the first weakness that I'm going to mention is that they do have weaker infantry overall. They do not have a great deal of heavy hitters with regards to their melee infantry. A lot of it tends to be on the cheaper side, which is good in its own way. However, this also infers the fact that they are not necessarily going to be the highest in terms of quality, and getting involved in a really heavy-duty engagement is not really something that the Hobbits want to do if they can at all help it. Certainly not without the proper support in place anyway. You need to be very careful with the Hobbit infantry. It can be surprisingly effective, but it won't be effective if you just charge it in unthinkingly. It's the same sort of situations that you send in resilient Western Kingdoms of Men units, or very powerful, elven units that are really strong in melee, or exceedingly resilient and, damaging dwarven infantry, or very numerous orc infantry. Factions like Angmar are very well known for their ability to come forward with a lot of brute strength. This is not something that the Shire can do. You need to be a little bit more clever with how you use your infantry. You can field quite a lot of it because of their relatively low expense and the fact that they do tend to have quite a lot of men in the unit. However, it's not the sort of force that's going to be able to win you the battle just through strength at arms alone. You're going to have to be a little bit more cunning than that. But I'm sure that if you're playing as the Shire, you kind of knew that going into it. So yeah, it's their infantry is technically weaker overall, even if their counter units are pretty good. You're going to need to be careful with how you use them. Something which applies to pretty much all of their units as well is the fact that they do tend to have lower armour and defensive values than a lot of other factions. As you would expect, the Hobbit folk of the Shire are not necessarily the best armour smiths, so generally speaking, it's a bunch of, farmers and simple hobbits that have armed themselves with, in some cases, surprisingly good weaponry. But they aren't necessarily the best at keeping themselves alive. Now again, they can make up for this by the fact that a lot of their units do tend to have quite a lot of hobbits in them. But, there's only so far that's going to carry you. There is something to be said for having, fewer units that will keep themselves alive better, rather than just having a slew of units which are easier to kill off. You will find it a bit of a struggle potentially to keep a lot of your units alive. Now, of course, at range, you can engage in skirmish fights again through sheer numbers and the fact that you can bring an awful lot of skirmishers, so it can be a risky proposition for other factions to actually engage the Shire in a ranged fight. However, certainly in melee, and especially if their melee units start taking ranged fire as well, a lot of their units do tend to be much more on the fragile side. Melee defense as well. It goes without saying that generally speaking, if a unit, particularly a cheaper unit, is armour piercing, their melee defense tends to suffer for that. They tend to be a little bit less skillful. And naturally the Hobbits are not exactly well known for being master warriors, so it makes a good deal of sense that their defensive skill is maybe not up to the same level as someone like even the Western Kingdoms of Men have got some units which are pretty skillful. That's not really something that the Hobbits can call upon. You're going to have to rely on setting up those, again, efficient engagements and using your ranged units to do a lot of damage to enemies on the approach, and even when they're in melee, sort of setting up your front line to take maximum advantage of the strengths that you do have. And both of these weaknesses that I've already mentioned are sort of going to build into the final one. It's sort of more of an intangible one, this, and more something that you can infer. I do believe that the Shire struggles a little bit more on the attack. Now, this isn't necessarily being aggressive in a field battle. The Shire can do that as long as they're careful. However, what I'm talking about is more in terms of like a siege, or if the enemy is in a sort of very defensive position on a field battle, so they've taken up position on top of a hill. getting up there can be quite an arduous task, and I feel as though the Shire are not the best equipped to deal with that. They can sort of leverage their ranged units in both the siege and in a situation where they're having to be on the attack. But the problem that I can foresee with this is, again, their special units are really the only thing they have which are very resilient and very damaging at the same time. A lot of their units tend to be on the cheaper side. They tend to be, you know, of the lower end of the spectrum in terms of units as a whole. And it's much more difficult to sort of set up engagements that are going to favour you if you're the one that's having to move forward into a very defensive situation, because the enemy is going to see what you're doing. So for example, if you're charging forward with a bunch of armour piercing infantry, then they can easily account for that. And I do feel as though even a faction on this sort of same mindset as the Orcs, while they do tend to have a lot of cheaper units as well, they also back this up by having units at the centre of them which are sort of holding the whole thing together. Even the Misty Mountains, which are a faction which exceedingly heavily rely on their numbers most of the time, especially in a siege. You know, they have a few units at the centre which sort of hold everything together. For the Shire, that's much more difficult, because a lot of their specialty units, like the Ents, you know, Ents act more like trolls, so they tend to sort of be diving into the enemy lines. The Beornings are cavalry, and they also have a unit of more elite Hobbit infantry, which is really the only unit they have in this regard. So it is difficult, I think, if you're the Hobbit and you're the Hobbits, I should say, and you're having to go into, in particular, a siege on the attack, and you're having to go into a very well-constructed defence. It can be difficult because it's, you know, you don't really have the same tools at your disposal as other factions do. You do have some artillery, but again, it's the kind of artillery which is not really the best when you're sort of trying to sort of get a defensive position like a siege, like a wall in a siege, to crumble. It's more designed to sort of force the enemy to come towards you in a more open battle. But with that in mind, I think it's about time we had a look at the Shires roster in a little bit more detail to really work out what's what with some of their units. So naturally, we're going to be on the hill at the back end of Hobbiton for having a look at the Shires roster, and with regards to their pure melee units, they don't have a huge variety, it must be said, but that shouldn't really be too surprising. They have 3 units of Hobbits and then of course one of their specialty units. We'll get right into it, however, with this unit over here, the Battling Brandy Bucks. So again, you can see here that they do have these rather nice axes and hammers that they use. So axes, of course, primarily designed for chopping down wood, I would imagine, and hammers that are clearly not designed for battle. They look like giant mallets more than anything else. But of course, with such weaponry comes the effectiveness against armour, which is a very useful thing. So for all intents and purposes, the Battling Brandy Bucks are essentially a cheap unit of AP shock infantry, which is very, very nice, of course. Only costing 450, so it does give you the kind of idea of what sort of unit that they are. Unlike some of the other units that we'll see in just a moment, they don't have anything uniquely special about them, really. However, a unit of Axemen like this is going to be very useful to get a good amount of cheap AP, which, again, it's going to be very important, as I said, for the Shire to pick their engagements well. So if you're going up against a faction that does have quite a lot of armoured units, in particular against sort of basic sort of sword and shield line infantry that relies heavily on armour, the Battling Brandy Bucks might not be the worst idea to send against them. 178 men in the unit, as I said, and obviously the main attraction is going to be the attack of 7 and the charge bonus of 12, all of which is AP, so getting a good charge off, getting that attack down in melee. But of course, the downside to all of this is the fact that their total defence is very poor. Again, this was more of a weakness that's across the Shire as a whole, outside of their sort of special units, but only a total defence of 6, armour value of 3, defensive skill of 3. While they are capable of dishing out a surprising amount of damage to certain kinds of units, you are going to struggle to keep them alive for a long period of time in the battle. It's definitely worth your while to try and stave off a full melee engagement for as long as possible for these reasons, and sort of only engage in the later game unless you are being supported by your allies, in which case you may be able to sort of play the support role for them, but you most certainly can't take the front with a unit like this. It's certainly not a unit of solid line infantry. However, the Shire do have access to this unit as well, a unit which has technically been in the game for quite a long time, the Hobbitry in Arms. So this unit has 252 men in the unit, and they are, it says they have very long spears, but they aren't a pike unit. They are certainly just a spear unit. However, it is a spear unit which is not only effective against cavalry but also effective against armour, so that extra bit of utility, as I mentioned, is something the Shire most certainly have in their favour when it comes to their infantry units. 252 men in the unit, a recruitment cost of 450 for an AP spear unit, which, you know, sounds pretty good. However, when you have a look at their stats, things become slightly less good. I mean, the Hobbitry and arms are pretty much the closest thing the Shire have to a unit of line infantry that can be massed up, and these are certainly not the kind of stats that you're going to need if you're sort of taking a more traditional engagement with a sort of solid front line and then trying to support it with other elements. Only an attack of 3, and while that is effective against armour and has a bonus against cavalry, they are still going to be subject to spear malices and the like, so, you know, it's going to be a struggle for them against units which are not heavily armoured, because they're just not going to be able to lay down any sort of damage quickly enough. However, cavalry is going to want to steer well clear of them because of all of these bonuses, and their total defence at least is a little bit better. They can sort of lay this down somewhat to the fact they have a shield, which is actually a section of fence, which is hilarious. So rather like the orc fodder have got what looks almost like a part of an old beer keg as their shields, the Hobbitry and arms now has a piece of fencing from their hobbit hole that they have decided to carry into battle to try and stave off the arrow fire. Also, their defensive skill and armour, though, maybe not the best. The total defense of 9 is maybe better than the battling Brandy bucks, but it's still nothing to write home about. Really, what gives them their strength, of course, is going to be their numbers, but even then, you're going to need to pick your engagement wisely with them, otherwise they're just going to be brushed aside by more genuinely powerful units. And then the final unit of all Hobbit infantry wielding their scythes from their cornfields, we have the Farmers of Buckland. So this is almost like a mix of the two units that we saw previously. They have an effectiveness against armour and a bonus fighting cavalry, so they're essentially a unit of shock infantry that has a bonus fighting cavalry, much like the Nandor Glade Guard that we saw previously, but also not at all like the Nandor Glade Guard, because whereas they're some of the finest elves that the easternmost portions of Middle-earth have to offer, these are hobbits who are more used to cutting down corn than orcs. So only 127 men in the unit as well, so they are far more easy to focus down because they don't really have anything extra in terms of defensive values keeping them alive from enemy archers, so they're just as vulnerable to that, only with less men. Their stats, however, are a little bit more impressive. With an attack of 11 and a charge bonus of 15, that's pretty damn nasty, honestly. You know, if you can get a good charge off with the Farmers of Buckland, they're going to be able to cut down some units. They're going to be able to punch well above their weight with attack stats like that. Their total defense values are not necessarily the worst either. I mean, again, a total defense of 9 is pretty poor, but considering the fact that they don't use a shield, you know, that is all bound up in their armour and defensive skill. Of course, this is still going to be a problem for them in a long engagement. A defensive skill of 5 is still not going to be able to keep them alive against, you know, again, genuinely decent heavy infantry from most other factions. But again, it's all about picking your engagements. If you can get a good charge off with them, you're going to be able to do pretty well with the Farmers of Buckland. But again, it's all about how you use them, because you're going to need to use, in particular, I think this infantry unit. The other two may be a little bit more disposable, but this unit, with how potentially damaging it can be off the charge and how much damage it can do in melee with an attack of 11, you do need to use them wisely because they will still struggle to keep themselves alive over a longer period of time. Finally, however, we have an extremely important unit for the Hobbits, and I think they're actually pointing the wrong way, interestingly enough. Indeed they are. We have the Ents, of course, as I sort of manoeuvre my camera into the right position here. The Ents are something that we have seen in the past, albeit as part of scenarios only and sort of the Rebels faction, which you could access, which had a bunch of units which no other faction was using, you know, sort of the spare units that were involving stuff like Oathbreakers. The Ents are very, very powerful. They're not the only faction that actually has access to the Ents, but I do feel as though the Shire are, of the two factions that have them, certainly the more reliant. I can see the Ents being used in 99 out of 100 Hobbit armies just because they are very, very powerful in melee. They're effective against armour in melee, they frighten nearby enemies as they should, they're living trees. Combat bonus in woods is also quite nice. I mean, hell, on a very heavily forested map, you might not even notice them coming. They can't necessarily hide, but it can be quite difficult to see them through the trees, interestingly enough, from a distance when you're surveying the whole battlefield. But of course this, where the Hobbits had somewhat poor stats in certain areas, the Ents have got extremely impressive stats, with an attack of 34, charge bonus of 10, total defense of 23, a lot of skill for moving trees, decent amount of armour as well, and of course they have 7 hit points. For all intents and purposes, they are on the same sort of level, if not more impressive, than the very best of the trolls. Units like Olag High or Trolls of the White Hand, they are battlefield juggernauts. They can wade through enemies, they're capable of getting an awful lot of kills, and they're very difficult to counter, whereas units like Mumakil and sort of the elephant class of units like Chariots have very distinctive counters, like javelins and crossbows can be very, very good against them if you focus fire them down. While technically speaking the Ents share that weakness to an extent, they do tend to hold up fairly well under javelin fire for a while, as well as crossbow fire, but obviously that does have a limited shelf life on it. 7 hit points is very difficult to burn your way through, especially in melee. However, there are only the very best infantry will be able to kill the Ents off with any sort of speed. If you're sending the Ents into just sort of standard line infantry, or pikes in particular, Ents are going to be very good at, because of course they share that ability to just smash through them with their huge mass, very much like the trolls. The Ents are going to be very, very good, and it's the one genuine powerhouse that the Shire's infantry force has available to it. But now we shall move on to the ranged units that the Shire has to offer, and they have quite a few of those, as I mentioned. So a pretty decent spread of units here. As I mentioned, they do have access to quite a few different kinds of ranged units that they can call upon, and we'll start off on their lower tier, the lower rungs here, and we shall start off with the Longbottom Mob, which of course, as I'm sure many people will be aware, are the Hobbit slingers that were in the game previously. I believe as well, something they have gained is an effectiveness against armour. I'm sure that you can see those weapons they have on their back, those big clubs. They almost look like the clubs from Dark Souls, to be honest with you, just like a big lump of wood. But that will help them out a little bit. Having said that, their stats in melee are still quite poor. But it does just go to show as well that, while the Hobbit skirmishers do tend to share a lot of the same weaknesses as the dedicated Hobbit infantry in melee, they do tend to have these little tricks, these little additional little bonuses, just to make life a little bit more difficult. Especially it has to be set against armoured units. The Hobbits do tend to match up much better against more heavily armoured factions than not. Not only because they can sort of wriggle out of engagements against the slower, more plodding, heavily armoured forces than not, but also just the fact they have more bonuses against them. But of course the Longbottom Mob, the Hobbit slingers, they throw their stones, and they tend to, well, technically speaking, they are javelins. I say that with the javelins / axe throwers. I say that with again, I only really need to point you to this stat here, missile attack of 2, which means that while they may have that projectile, it's a very low base damage, which means while you can do a lot of damage over a long period of time, like they do have a pretty decent amount of ammunition, and certainly in a battle like a siege, you can put them into a position where they can fire for a long period of time and get a lot of damage done that way. But ultimately they're not going to be able to knock down foes as quickly as a unit of dedicated javelins would. But fortunately, the Shire does have options elsewhere for that sort of thing. But certainly there is a place for the Longbottom Mob, as has been shown in many replays in the past. The Hobbit slingers can be surprisingly effective, and now that they've gained a melee weapon as well, perhaps that will only increase their capabilities. Having said that, their melee stats are still nothing to write home about. Like, this would certainly be, melee attack of 6 and a charge bonus of 8 is, not necessarily the worst thing for a unit of skirmishers that cost 450. Their total defense is still woeful. This is the sort of thing which would definitely be listed as a negative for most other factions. But something else which is very important to note, which is true for the vast majority of the Shire skirmishers, which is very important to them as well, is that they can hide anywhere. All of their infantry is, sort of just out there. They tend to not be able to hide, as well as their Ents, of course. But their skirmishers most certainly can, and this ability to sort of ambush on the fly with your skirmishers is very important to the Shire. If you can get off a good ambush with them and sort of set up a killing field that the enemy doesn't know they're walking into, that's when the Shire are at their very strongest. And this is, maybe not the Longbottom Mob in particular, but this is something that all of their skirmishers do tend to share, with one exception. Speaking of which, we do have a unit of non-Hobbits here. We have the Bandits. The Bandits making their return to the standard forces, the standard armies, rather than just being marooned in the rebels. And they have also been changed pretty substantially mechanically. They are, technically speaking, javelins. Now, I decided to include them here in the ranged unit list because, you know, they do have a ranged attack, albeit it is very limited in scope. It doesn't have a great deal of ammunition. And also you can see here, javelins thrown before charge. So this is essentially one of those units in the game where they will throw one volley in, and then they will charge into melee. So the javelin volley that they get off, it may only be a missile attack of 4, but we've seen before, again, how good javelins can be, very nice armor piercing. And they will be able to do noticeably more damage with their projectiles than the Longbottom Mob that we just looked at. But again, don't expect them to be all conquering along the lines of the higher tier javelins like the Seafarers of Nindamos, or in particular stuff like the Demons of the Desert. But they will still be able to pick away at the enemy's manpower, and that is going to be very key as the Shire. You're going to need to try and sort of hack down the enemies on the approach, do enough damage to them, and then overwhelm them in melee. And then the bandits will charge in, and to be fair, I mean, the bandits' stats are not brilliant in melee, if we're being honest. A melee attack of 5 and a charge bonus of 3 is relatively standard for a unit of line infantry, it must be said. But then they kind of fall down a little bit in terms of their total defense, where most other, particularly with the Western Kingdoms of Men, if we're going to compare them in that regard, you know, they will have much higher defensive values than this. You know, much higher in terms of their armor, much higher in terms, well, noticeably higher in terms of their defensive skill, and their shields will tend to be a little bit better as well. But when you're playing as the Shire, beggars can't be choosers. You need some units which have a little bit more rigidity in melee, and weirdly enough, the bandits find themselves in that role. But of course, they can still hide anywhere, so you can set up a nice little ambush. They'll throw their javelins after revealing their position, and then they'll get into melee to do as best a job as they can. But of course, javelins thrown before charge, it is a unit that you will need to get used to. Like, you might not even be able to use up all the ammunition on the bandits. You may just need to throw a single volley and then allow them to be in melee. You know, the javelins thrown before charge trait is one that does take a little bit of getting used to. But honestly, I feel as though with the Shire, you kind of need, you know, the additional strength, in quotation marks, that the bandits will offer you on the front line sooner rather than later. So after a single volley is maybe all that you will need. And then finally, the most basic unit of archers here on the lower rungs of the Hobbit forces, we have the Tookish Hunters, which are a very basic unit of archers, of course. Terrible stats, as well as only 1 armor, so they're going to be, you know, not great in a skirmish fight. They're going to have to rely on their numbers more than anything else in a skirmish fight to really be effective at all. Also, their melee stats are terrible. You know, a melee attack of 3, defensive skill of 4. To be fair, it could be worse, I suppose. Of course, they can hide anywhere, which is a nice little addition. You know, again, like I said, only one of the Hobbit range units can't do that. And their missile attack is 5. So at the very least, a missile attack of 5 for a unit that costs 550 is good. I mean, you know, at least it's not a missile attack of 4, so they are capable of dealing a little bit more damage than the very lowest tier of archers. But even so, I mean, this is the entry-level Hobbit archers, so the Hobbits definitely have some more potent options on offer, which we'll get onto in just a moment. But still, a very important part of the Shire is going to be utilising your ranged units, and the Tookish Hunters are going to be the most bread-and-butter unit that you have at your disposal. Now, however, a unit that will be very familiar to anyone who has played Reforged in the past, because they have been available ever since vanilla, and that is going to be the Bando brass archers. You can see that they have got those clubs, but I don't believe they're armor piercing in melee. But you know, with a weapon like that, you would almost expect them to be honest with you. You can see from just their appearance that they do have some sort of armor at the very least. That sort of the chain shirt and the little bit of additional leather that they have. But even so, their armor value is only 4, so they're still not going to be great in a skirmish fight, if we're being honest. Their best defense, once again, is going to be the fact they can hide anywhere. They can also use flaming missiles. A little bit better in melee all around as well. A little bit of a higher melee attack at 6. Their defensive skill of 7 as well is not terrible. Their charge bonus is not brilliant, but a little bit better in melee. But even so, you're definitely going to want to use as much of their ammunition as possible before committing them in to a melee engagement, because they're still not going to do brilliantly against a lot of other units, to be honest. But they also have a missile attack of 6, so again, the slightly increased cost means that you get a missile attack of 6, and to be honest with you, for an archer that only costs 600 florins, a missile attack of 6 is not half bad. You know, they're going to be able to deal a pretty decent amount of damage, considering their lower recruitment cost, which again plays into the Shire being a little bit more reliant on their ranged units, and they're, you know, getting their ambushes off, doing the damage at range before being forced into a melee engagement more than anything. Only 142 men in the unit, however, less than the Tookish Hunters, so again, in a skirmish fight they're still not going to be brilliant, even if the armor value is slightly higher. You certainly don't want to get into an atrocious engagement in any sense of the word with the Shire, whether that be infantry or archers if you can help it. You definitely want to be doing as much damage as you possibly can at range into enemy units if that is possible. But then we have a unit which is going to be very well known to anyone. We have the Doudna Dine Rangers, which I believe they share a unit model with the Arthedain variety of the Doudna Dine Rangers, because I know that Cardland have got their own model now as well. I believe this is the one that Arthedain used. But of course Rangers, everyone knows what Rangers are all about. They are much better in melee as well. Melee attack of 12, defensive skill of 12. It means they're going to be able to look after themselves much better in melee. It's quite telling when one of the strongest sort of units of infantry in melee all around turns out to be your Rangers. Just goes to show the Shire certainly doesn't have a great deal of muscle when it comes to their infantry. They're much more reliant on their attack bonuses than anything else. Of course, they can hide anywhere as well. Combat bonus in the woods is always quite nice if you're playing on that sort of map. 850 is relatively standard for a unit of human Rangers like this. Missile attack of 4, but of course, as has been said previously, the body-piercing arrows are what makes the Rangers so good. Again, for anyone who hasn't somehow sort of been involved with Reforged up till now, the body-piercing ammunition, it doesn't dissipate after hitting just one model in the enemy unit. It will continue to pass through them and pass through multiple unit models before dissipating. And this is any enemy blobs are going to do. There's going to be a lot of damage that is done to enemy blobs, as I get my words out. Very good unit, obviously very important to the Shire, I feel like, even more so. Certainly in a defensive siege, but even in an offensive siege, because as I said, I don't really think the Shire are brilliant when they're on the attack in a siege. They have much fewer options. They're much better at sort of drawing the enemy into their country, rather than being on the aggressive side of things themselves. And the Rangers are one of the few units that if they can get it into the right position, they will be able to do a lot of damage to them. Still, very, very good unit for them to have access to. They're going to be very reliant on the amount of damage that Rangers can do. A lot of high potential kills that you can get. And then finally, the final unit that we'll be having a look at here are the Proudfoot Protectors, a unit that costs 1,000, a unit of crossbows, as I'm sure you can see, able to make shield wall, bonus fighting cavalry, effectiveness against armour, so effectively their spears in melee with the ability to make shield wall. They kind of remind me a little bit of the Minotaur Roman Guardians from Cardland. Just the fact that they are these, quite nasty crossbows, missile attack of 14, armour-piercing projectiles as well with those crossbows. Higher tier crossbows can be vicious, and the Proudfoot Protectors are higher tier crossbows. They actually have decent armour as well at 7, and as if that wasn't enough, you can upgrade the armour, although I don't believe, the unit model itself doesn't really change a huge amount. There's a few little extra strips of armour, maybe, on their arms, but there isn't a great deal of difference in the unit model there, so that will of course make them just that little bit more resilient. Having said that, you really don't want them to get caught out by archers in the first place. They do have a shield value of 5, however, so armour of 8, shield of 5, one of the more resilient units to enemy ranged units in general. And that is potentially important because they are the only unit of Hobbit skirmishers that cannot hide. I'm sure that you noticed that they can deploy stakes. The reason that they're the only ones that can deploy stakes, I think, is all the other unit of Shire skirmishers can hide, and if you deploy stakes, that gives away where your ambush is entirely. Whereas the Proudfoot Protectors, of course, they don't have to worry about that. Only stakes available to this unit. Decent in melee, as I said. Decent spearmen in melee. But the main thing is, of course, going to be their vicious ranged attack. That missile damage, the crossbows, very, very nice. Of course, they won't have the same sort of range as your archers, but going to be one of the best DPS tools that you have access to as the Shire. Certainly a good unit all round here. Yeah, I feel as though a unit of crossbows like this can really be used to tie your line together. It's going to be one of the tools that you also have to help zone out cavalry. The Shire does have access to quite a few anti-cavalry units, to be fair. But certainly from range, this is going to be the sort of unit that enemy cavalry is not going to want to get anywhere near if they can help it. Defensive skill of 5 is maybe where they fall down a little bit, but to be fair, these stats are pretty damn good for a Hobbit unit, I have to say. We shall now move on to their cavalry, which is a little bit less extensive than their ranged force here, but nonetheless, there's still some very important units that they have access to there. So just the 2 units of cavalry that the Shire has access to, which shouldn't be too surprising. I mean, the Shire certainly not renowned like Rohan for their horsemen, but still, one of them can also upgrade their armour, so that means that we have 3 unit models here to have a look at. And we will start off with the Hobbit Cavalry, the only unit to to actually have hobbits riding, and that's going to be the Sheriffs of the Farthings. So for all intents and purposes, this unit, I would say, bonus fighting cavalry, effective against armour, sort of very much sort of used to respond to enemy cavalry, as it were. Missile attack of only 4, like if you have a look there, they've got sort of pouches of stones, much like the Longbottom Mob. However, they do have a missile attack of 4, so they are a little bit more effective with their ranged attack. And honestly, in melee, they're not half bad. I mean, a melee attack of 6, a total defense of 16. They have that shield, which certainly contributes to that shield of 6. Not going to be quite so easy to kill off from range because of that shield. Defensive skill of 6, armor of 4. I mean, these are still stats which are, in the grand scheme of things, not brilliant, but among the ranks of the Shire, not half bad. But yeah, I think if we have a look as well at the upgraded model, I feel as though, yeah, it's just the same. They have the potential to upgrade their armor if they so desire, which will of course increase their total defense quite noticeably, and it's definitely worthwhile doing that, especially if you do intend to get them mixed up in enemy cavalry, because they will need all the help they can get in spite of their bonuses. But I do feel as though the units that you can most readily compare them to obviously is going to be the cavalry that has those thrown projectiles, but in particular stuff like maybe the Coldfell Maidens or the Riddermark Skirmishers. They're certainly not going to be on the same sort of level as those units. Like, both of those units got absolutely vicious ranged attacks, and then in melee they're not half bad either, especially the Riddermark Skirmishers with those axes that they wield. But it's the same sort of role that I feel as though the Sheriffs of the Farthings are going to be taking on, trying to sort of skirmish down enemy cavalry, really take the teeth off of them, and then obviously all of your anti-cavalry units in melee, as well as stuff like your crossbows and javelins and archers, will then be able to finish them off. I mean, 650 is not a huge recruitment cost for a unit of cavalry that's got this much utility, but you do have to remember that, as with most of the units of the Shire, their stats just aren't going to be able to carry them to the same sort of heights as other units can. So they are a decent counter unit once again, and that is really the theme of the Shire, as I mentioned at the start when talking about their strengths and weaknesses. They do have a lot of decent counter units, but they don't necessarily then have the brute strength to take advantage of the openings that their counter units can give them. And I feel as though the Sheriff of the Farthings are one of the best expressions of that, because they can be very useful on horseback to skirmish with the enemy cavalry, especially if you can use them in conjunction with allied cavalry, but they just don't have a great deal of punch in and of themselves, which is somewhat natural considering they are, obviously hobbits on horseback. One unit that most certainly does have a great deal of punch, however, is the second of their, what I dubbed their sort of specialty units, their special units. The Beornings have also made their return to the regular roster, much like the Ents that we saw before and the Bandits. Unlike those two units, however, which, the Shire does share with a couple of other factions in the game, the Beornings are completely unique to the Shire, and you only have to look at their stats and some of their abilities to realise how scary these wild men riding bears are. Attack of 17, a charge bonus of 10, very, very nice, of course, offensive stats. And the Beornings are much more of an offensive unit than they are defensive, because their total defence, is mainly based around their defensive skill, which is interesting for a unit that wields an axe. But they don't have a shield, their armour is very poor, so as soon as their 3 hit points are expended, which to be fair, 3 hit points is a lot for a unit of cavalry that can move around at speed like the Beornings. Most units that have more hit points like this tend to be, like entry-level trolls. Recruitment cost of 1500 is on the more expensive side, but most of the Shire's army is cheap enough to the point where you're going to be easily able to field the Beornings and the Ents together in the same army, to be honest with you, and that will give you a lot of potential damage spikes throughout the field. Expert hiding in woods, so again, much like a lot of the other Shire forces, particularly their skirmishers, they can hide, which is always nice, setting up that ambush. If people don't see the Beornings coming, their charge can be absolutely devastating. Obviously effective against armour, naturally they're going to frighten nearby enemies as well. A lot of good stats that they have available to them, the Beornings, and they are going to be very important to how the Shire operates, especially on an open field, I would have to say, because they most certainly give you that fast-moving damage spike that the Shire so desperately needs in order to keep pace damage-wise with a lot of the other factions. So they're not entirely reliant on their skirmishers to do their damage. They do have, obviously, their Ents and their Beornings to really help prop them up as well. But it is worth saying that you do need to look after them to an extent, because while they do have 3 hit points, that will keep them alive at least for a while. If they do start getting focused down, they're going to be in trouble, because an armour of 3 and no shields is bad for them. You really don't want to lose the Beornings for nothing, otherwise you're going to be facing a very difficult task. You can't lose a unit that's costing 1500 florins and expect to be on the upward trajectory with any faction, but especially for the Shire, because of how important their more expensive units are to them. But with that, we shall move on to the Shire's one and only piece of artillery. So we just have the one piece of artillery that the Shire has available to them, and as I'm sure you can see from the unit model at the very least, mechanically speaking, it's very much similar. I was going to say, that doesn't make any sort of sense, does it? It's very similar to the siege equipment that Khand has available to them, and it is Gandalf's fireworks. So mechanically speaking, it is going to be much the same as the Watcher. It is a very interesting piece of siege equipment in general, and I've said this before about the Khandish Watcher, but it is one of the more useful pieces of artillery on the open field, because one of the ways in which people tend to counteract artillery on the open field, especially veteran players who don't panic in the face of seeing a catapult sort of shooting into their lines, is to just spread your men out, sort of spread them out into thin lines in loose formation, and even if the catapult hits, ends up only getting 3 or so kills at a time, and even then it might not hit because of the accuracy of artillery. However, the Watcher, and now by extension the Gandalf's fireworks, much better at that, because even if you spread out your men as much as you can, because of the wide area of effect that Gandalf's fireworks will have, you will still be able to get a decent amount of kills. Not necessarily on individual units, you won't be able to focus down individual units with them, but you'll be able to spread out a decent amount of kills across the enemy army, which is good. If the enemy just decides to sit there and take it, the Gandalf's fireworks can rack up a decent little kill count for itself. However, the main draw of using this piece of siege equipment is because it's more difficult to counteract its effects by just sort of absorbing the shots it has by spreading out, is that it will tend to force your opponent to be more aggressive, force them into you, and that's exactly what the Shire want. The Shire want the enemy to come towards them. They want to be the ones responding to an enemy push and then really going to town on them with their counter units and their ranged units. And the fireworks are honestly one of their best tools in order to do that, especially on the open field. Now, in a siege, less useful, to be honest with you. I mean, an attack bonus versus buildings of only 20 means that it's going to be difficult for them to break down fortifications with them. Nonetheless, it's definitely a useful piece of siege equipment for the Shire to have, and it only costs 850, which in the artillery world is pretty cheap, honestly. It's only a little bit more expensive than a standard ballista, which interestingly enough is the main counter to a unit of a Watcher or a Gandalf's fireworks, because a ballista could of course just snipe them out quickly, which would be interesting to see if bringing a ballista becomes standard practice against the Hobbits, because I feel as though the fireworks will show up more often than not just to panic the enemy, because it is difficult to deal with when you see all of these little rockets falling in. It is technically inaccurate, as I said, but again, the wide area of effect means it's going to hit stuff. It says inaccurate against troops, but it affects such a wide area that if you target the middle of the enemy army, you're going to hit stuff. Like, you're going to hit a decent amount of men. But the real value from this unit comes in forcing the enemy to come towards you. That's true of Khand in their Watcher, but it's especially true for the Shire, because the Shire are very much at home when they are responding to an enemy push, as I said. Effective against armour as well, but of course that's true against with all artillery, because if it hits a unit model, it's going to kill them. But yeah, that is the entirety of the Shire's roster, and we'll finish with my thoughts on the faction as a whole, I think. The Shire certainly raised a few eyebrows when it was announced that they were going to become their own faction, but it was a little bit less of an arduous undertaking to add than some of the others, because of course the Hobbit models were already in place, as well as the models for stuff like the Ents and the Beornings, so it wasn't quite the same situation as is going on with Ered Luin and Dol Guldur, where entirely new custom assets and mechanics need to be developed for them. The Shire, I think, it's already developed a bit of a cult following among many of the people on the various discords that Reforged is associated with. Obviously, I mean, the meme potential for the Hobbits is very high, but also I feel as though the Shire, it definitely appeals to players who want to be a little bit more creative with things, because you can't just play the Shire in the same way as you play many of the other factions, whether that be in the same way as the Orcs and rushing forward with great numbers, whether that be with, you know, the Kingdoms of Men or Dwarves, where you form up a very solid front line and then do your damage with a few units, or the Elves, where of course you sort of have your master warriors and, you know, you may have few numbers but they're so good individually. The Shire is certainly not any of that. They are very unique in and amongst themselves. They are an entity all of their own, and definitely appeals to people who are problem solvers. I think they, you know, you can't. it is going to be quite interesting to see how people play the Shire. Like, they are vicious little buggers, to be honest with you. Like, they are... It has been revealed through games already on 0.97 that the Shire, individually, to look at their roster and, you know, listening to me talk about them, you might think that, you know, they are noticeably the weakest faction in the game. And technically speaking, you're correct, but that isn't really true in practice, because if you do use the Shire to their fullest capabilities, really using their hiding mechanics, really using their counter units to their fullest extent, they're difficult to hack their way through, and, you know, they can do damage. You know, they are very capable of doing damage. Keeping your army alive is going to be a challenge, but using your important units, using your skirmishers, using your ambushes, very, very good for the Shire. Like, again, they're going to appeal to players who like ambushes. They're going to appeal to players who I think like to be a little bit more, not necessarily reactive, but I feel as though they're going to appeal to players who like to draw the enemy to them and then do the damage that way, rather than sort of taking the front foot themselves. You know, the Shire, if they do that, they can technically, but it's going to be more of a struggle for them to make that work. I feel as though the Shire will definitely appeal to them. And of course, if you just want to be a meme master and play as the Hobbits and try and take on Sauron in Barad-dûr and bring down the Dark Lord using an army of Hobbits, you can attempt to do that now in the game as it stands. Personally, I don't think the Shire really appeals to my playstyle all that much, because again, I like a nice, at least a selection of solid units that I can use potentially, and the Shire doesn't really have that. You're kind of entirely reliant on your specialty units and your skirmishers, and also I tend to like being a little bit more aggressive and on the front foot, which the Shire doesn't necessarily reward all that much. But still, it's still an interesting experience to play the Shire, just because of how utterly different they are from everything else on the faction selection screen. So yeah, I hope you found this somewhat informative. The next faction that we're going to be getting involved with all of the factions that were in the game previously, but there are so much new stuff in pretty much all of them. I mean, at least, you know, there's going to be at least some significant mechanical changes, new unit models, or just outright new units in the factions we're going to be looking at, and a lot of them have had some substantial enough changes that I think we can restart all of them in general. So I believe we'll start off with the very first faction that's on the faction selection screen in Gondor, and then we'll move on through the various race groups. So I think we'll go Western men, Orcs, Elves, Eastern men, Dwarves. I think that's how we're going to do things. Regardless, Gondor will be the next faction we take a look at, I think, because I already have the work done on them to be able to do a faction overview on them, I think. So yeah, Gondor will be next. We'll be restarting the factions that were already in the game. I hope you enjoyed this. Hope you found it somewhat informative, and I hope you will join me for whatever is next.